Arana Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We come to some trouble here as a parliament when the government has been asked a series of reasonable questions which are in the public interest about how a worker was treated and constitutional questions of responsibility in a timeline which has not been disclosed. And instead of the government, ministers who have fronted this debate acknowledging those questions and endeavouring to answer them, they have in fact attacked the opposition. So we're at a crossroads here where we as a parliament can accept that and move on, and that is the standard that ministers will be held to in the future, or we can choose to pursue these questions. And I hope that we do. I hope all members of this House take it incredibly seriously that it is not clear whether the Prime Minister himself knew about the situation that the worker was treated in. It is not clear whether Cabinet knew. It is not clear whether that information has been compiled, and it certainly has not been made public. And, the ACT Party have argued in this debate that this is a waste of time, and we had a national member who has resumed his seat say that this debate was a farce, when in fact we should be focusing on the cost of living. Well, Mr Speaker, the irony is that for Minister Bailey's resignation, for the few New Zealanders who did know his name, he will always be remembered as a minister with issues of personal conduct, and yet he was the only minister around the table who was charged with the most important issue on voters' minds right now, which is the cost of living, which is the fact that New Zealanders are being charged too much at the supermarket and too much in banking services. He was the person charged with his incredibly responsibility, and yet we now have a supermarket plan which is weak. It has no hope of reducing prices for Kiwis and no minister to stand behind it. It is completely indicative of the crisis that the National Party faces now. There's no shortage of tough talk on corporate interests, but nobody around the table who will actually back it up with regulatory reform, and no plan to see prices coming down for ordinary Kiwis. So what are we meant to take away from the way this government operates? We're actually seeing big corporates responding to those signals. Instead of the supermarkets being out there in the newspapers saying how they have a plan to address the cost of living for ordinary consumers at the checkout, they are in fact telling NBR that they are redoubling their efforts to lobby government, that it is more in the interests of corporates to get cosy with government ministers than it actually is to bring down prices for ordinary New Zealanders across many sectors. That's because this government is going from announcement to chaos, and there is no one who is willing to take on the leadership that it will require to actually make serious change. And when we think about what the Commerce Minister, who was so passionate about those portfolios, will be remembered for, it is for being the minister who obfuscated about calling a worker a loser and then was caught out in question time. It is for being a minister who asked a worker repeatedly to join him and his staff who were having drinks. And it is a minister who didn't seem to get a worker's hesitance to say no to him when he was on the job late on a Friday night. That is the legacy of this government in the competition space. That is the record for consumers, and it is a shame in the record of that government who promised at the election that they would address these consumer issues and the lack of competition in these sectors and actually bring prices down. This will all require more leadership than what we are seeing now. The government is so out of touch with how important these cost of living issues are for ordinary Kiwis that it is not putting the people on the job who should be on the job. The guy who was around the table, who had responsibility for this and was out there telling the supermarkets that they were on notice, has now resigned, and his portfolios have been consigned to the most junior minister in Cabinet. The government requires leadership. Governing requires leadership. And the Prime Minister has been asked to explain the nature of the complaint. No government minister would come down here and tell us what the plan is to ensure that this worker's story is taken into account when addressing the conduct issues of minister on that side of the House. This Parliament is no clearer about how things will improve, and nobody in New Zealand is clear about this government's plan to improve things for ordinary Kiwis who are paying too much at the checkout. Both of these things require leadership, and on both counts, this government is failing. We deserve, as New Zealanders, to understand what the standard is for ministers. People in government need to hold themselves to a higher standard and to make it clear what has happened and to own up to it and take responsibility.